Welcome to Weekends with Michael Brooks and Anna Kasparian. Well, this is the Jacobin magazine. Hey, Anna, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's been a turbulent, crazy week. Now more than ever, I think it's very clear for most Americans, but I got to experience it firsthand, that we need to socialize all of our hospitals, no more private hospitals. My mother was taken to the emergency room for an emergency appendectomy, but we didn't know what was wrong with her. She was vomiting, and I was obviously very concerned that she had coronavirus. Yeah. And so she was sent to the closest emergency room, which is at a private hospital. And the way she was treated there was just incredible. Would not give her a coronavirus test until they exhausted all other options. They gave her all sorts of different tests, including a CAT scan, which indicated that she had acute appendicitis. And then even though they realized that she needed to have surgery right away, she was out of network. So they decided to contact the doctor where she's in network and wait for a response. And that just blew my mind as well. And for days, literally days, we didn't know if she had coronavirus, if they were going to give her a test. She wasn't given a test until she was moved to the hospital that's in network. This is just madness. It's madness. She could have easily died.
How is she now, Anna?
So now she's stabilizing a little bit. But when she was given morphine at the private hospital, which apparently didn't look at her health record, that unfortunately impacted her heart. Then she was moved to the ICU. It was the worst week easily of my life.
Oh, I'm really sorry. And yeah. I know we were in touch this week, and obviously, and it's terrible. And thank God. I mean, the most important thing, obviously, is that she's doing better. And thankfully, yes, she did not have the virus. Obviously, as a really good friend of mine, this is like, it hits me personally because of our friendship. And as you say, I mean, this is just, I could tell you at least a couple relatively similar stories that I've heard in the last couple of weeks in New York, some of which, unfortunately, have had much worse endings. It's barbarous. And this is the real stuff. I mean, you need to have a social health care system. I mean, this is just the basic building block of anything. And, there is something that just is, I mean, it's obviously disgusting and dangerous and already causes tens of thousands of people's premature deaths a year. And it's only going to get infinitely worse with Corona and being in an economic depression. But I think even, culturally, it just, the feeling and the atmosphere that it creates, that we overtly say that, tens of millions of lives, and even more when you count basically just completely insufficient healthcare packages, are just expendable, that they're just second to getting parasite companies basically broker rates to perform a completely unnecessary market service. Like, they don't add anything. HMOs and insurance companies add nothing. They're completely unnecessary parasitic middlemen. And it just couldn't be more disgusting.
Yeah. And it's just, private hospitals, by their very nature, put profit over saving human lives. And that is just, there's a great piece in Jacobin written by Luke. I forget his last name. Sorry. But like, he writes no, not Savage. Anyway, I'm sorry. During the break, I'll grab the piece and I'll give credit where credit is due, because he writes excellent pieces on healthcare. And I read his piece about socializing hospitals just this morning, and it makes all the sense in the world. There should not be a profit motive behind our healthcare model, whether it has to do with hospitals or the private insurance industry, because that system, just by its nature, makes you ill-prepared, makes the country ill-prepared to deal with what we're dealing with now, which is this pandemic. And like the chaos, the fear, the lack of communication, all of that is just inherent in the system that we're dealing with right now. And no one should go a minute, let alone 2 days as I did, not knowing what the status of their loved one is. And that's just what so many Americans are dealing with right now. The system is unbelievably cruel, nonsensical, and at a time when you would expect, real change to spur from all of this tragedy, we're getting the opposite. We're going to talk about that a little more in detail in the show today.
Absolutely. And of course, joining us today is John Nichols. He's national affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine, and he's author of Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, the enduring legacy of Henry Wallace's anti-fascist, anti-racist politics. Henry Wallace, we'll get to it more, but I remember years ago listening to an interview about Henry Wallace on WBUR, I think, which was the Boston NPR station, with this really good journalist named Christopher Lydon, who probably was one of the first people that I ever listened to that made me want to do this kind of work. And it was about Henry Wallace with this former Iowa senator who had written a biography of him probably at this point like 20 years ago. And I just remember being mind blown. Like, obviously I knew the New Deal did a lot of good things, was really important, but it blew my mind that somebody like Henry Wallace was vice president of the United States. So there's going to be a lot to learn in John's book. And, he's probably in some ways more hopeful about where things are at in terms of the Democratic Party than you and I are. So it would be good to get his historically grounded optimism. As always, guys, if you're new to the channel, hit subscribe, give us a like. I think at some point we're going to start trying to take questions later in the show from the YouTube. So look out. But first, let's get to our commentaries, and I will start with the absolutely horrifying news that happened over the last couple of days, that the Senate has allowed the FBI to search your browser history without a warrant. This is part of a larger package to, in terms of reading up on the Patriot Act, which shouldn't be done regardless. This bill passed with 10 votes from Democrats and Bernie Sanders, certainly to the everlasting shame of the 10 Democrats and Bernie Sanders, shamefully, I will say, as a big Bernie Sanders fan, obviously, actually missed this vote for whatever reason. Now, this is an extraordinary escalation. The idea that the FBI can look at anybody's web browser histories without even a warrant, basically at the discretion of Bill Barr, who has a very serious contempt for civil liberties and open institutions, deems it necessary, they can look at your browser history. This should threaten and concern all of us. And of course, this fits a much longer pattern of the erosion of privacy and civil liberties, some of which we talked with Glenn Greenwald about last week, if you haven't seen it yet. The Patriot Act passed after the September 11th attacks, the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. We saw the massive NSA surveillance that was revealed by Edward Snowden's whistleblowing and reported in 2012 with still no significant reforms. We've seen a FISA court that essentially functions as a rubber stamp for requests from the government for spying and monitoring. Now, in the Senate, and in Congress, there are constructive political coalitions that have mostly unsuccessfully pushed back against this encroachment on our privacy and rights. And those coalitions involve people on the left and progressives, obviously, and libertarian-oriented folks on the right, your Justin Amash's or Rand Paul or Mike Lee's. And legislatively, this is really, really important. But philosophically and analytically, we need to make a distinction here between a libertarian concern for civil rights and civil liberties that only sees the government, which of course the government certainly can be and is a deep threat to our privacy and civil liberties, as exemplified by programs conducted by the CIA, NSA, and others, but stop short at holding private power accountable because of their market fundamentalist politics. And a socialist approach would have to recognize that, first of all, the modern national security state is a permeable sort of integration of public and private interests, that even going back to the NSA spying revelations, we saw significant use of private contractors, collaboration with telecoms and other private interests in getting our data. Corona has opened up new ways of partnering with private companies like Apple and Google to monitor people's behavior. Some of this might be necessary for things like tracing and other urgent areas necessary for containing the virus, but they open up entirely new ranges of encroachment on people's privacy, from their movements to their data. And this is a threat to everybody in their day in and day out lives, and certainly a threat to folks who want to engage in politics in times of increasing austerity and authoritarian tendencies internationally. And it's really important, though, to understand that in some ways the engine of this repression now is private. It does not come from the public sector in the same way. It comes from this integration between private and public, and taking on the private is more difficult than taking on the public. Even in today's world, with a lot of timidity around exposing the wrongdoings of the CIA and US foreign policy, that much more difficult to seriously and systemically look at corporate power in this country and its threats to our civil liberties. And I want to talk about a great piece that was written by the journalist Mark Ames in a now defunct website, Pando Daily, that came out May 28th, 2015. And I'd recommend everybody read this article. It was an in-depth look at Seymour Hersh, the incredibly well-known and well-regarded investigative journalist who exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and up until I think to this day has done significant work in exposing the wrongdoings of the US national security state, CIA, foreign policy, and any number of significant areas of that relevant to foreign policy and civil liberties. I'm going to quote now from Mark Ames, and because he talks about the term muckraking journalism. In its original meaning, muckraking journalism is all about exposing the awful power that corporations, trusts, and monopolies exercised over people on the broader interest. So why doesn't Seymour Hersh, considered the premier muckraker of the past few decades, turn his fearless muckraking guns on private corporate power? And what unfolds from this article is in no ways a condemnation of Seymour Hersh. It's actually a moving and disturbing sort of story of Seymour Hersh's attempts in the mid-70s, at the height of his career success, and with some backing from his employer, the New York Times, to take the same investigative approach that he had used to expose US foreign policy and CIA wrongdoing, to take on a massive corporate conglomerate in the 1970s, Gulf and Western, which had its fingers in everything from Dominican sugar fields, oil, the film industry. It had connections to organized crime, and it impacted most areas of American life. Seymour Hersh wanted to do the same treatment for this private company that he had done for the US intelligence service. And I'll quote now again from Ames. Hersh's massive Gulf and Western expose was published in the Times in 1977, 13,000 words long in 3 parts, revealing a private labyrinth of corporate fraud, abuse, tax avoidance schemes, and mobbed-up malfeasance. Yet, in spite of all the pre-publication hype, the story landed with a whimper, something Hersh wasn't at all used to. I expected a lot more explosive stuff, commented a former G&W executive. The reasons were pretty straightforward. Unlike Hersh's stories going after the CIA and the military, the Times was more afraid and careful of the consequences of taking on a powerful private company, Gulf and Western, and getting sued out of existence. Unlike Hersh's muckraking stories about illegal CIA spying and military massacres, the Times saddled Hersh with a team of editors and lawyers to vet his reporting, sucking the life out of his piece until it was almost unreadable. Among other things, the Times cut all of the colorful anonymous quotes that made his muckraking bombshells on the CIA and more recently on the Osama bin Laden killing such memorable reads. Now, this is an incredibly good piece. I'd recommend you'd read it, and a lot of Mark Ames's reporting. He's a really, really good reporter. But this would only more significantly apply today. We've seen complete gutting of journalism in general. Investigative capacities have been radically diminished, and corporations, even more so than government, are absolutely, and this piece documents it even going back to the 70s, ruthless in their willingness to threaten in every way, shape, and form journalism so that it does not expose their systemic wrongdoing. Fast forwarding to today, with that terrifying piece of legislation passed in the Senate, something that I think even Mitch McConnell thought he was stretching to put in that bill, but ended up getting passed with the help of Democrats like Sheldon Whitehouse and Bob Casey. We got to look at these new surveillance systems as public-private partnerships and understand that the private is even harder to expose and has way more power than the public. So legislation and work in Congress and partnerships between the left and right on containing those abuses is incredibly important legislatively, but we also need to have a much bigger critique and understanding of what actually threatens our rights, from journalism to privacy, and it's the corporate sector.
Definitely. I mean, this week has been pretty devastating for writers over at Vice. Many of them have been let go. And yeah, it's just devastating because we've seen this like dismantling of important journalism, not just yesterday, but for a while now. And there really aren't many places for muckraking journalists to even work without fear of censorship or retaliation if they refuse to go along with what their editors want. And so now more than ever, I agree with you. It's important to do what we can to protect journalism. And I also think it's important to not get too distracted by the antics of Donald Trump and place all the blame of what's happening to journalists on him, even though he has been brutal, disgusting, obviously someone who doesn't see violations of the First Amendment as much of an issue. But he's really a symptom of what we've been seeing for decades now. And so, the way he riles up protesters to attack journalists should be condemned. But I think that it should also be condemned when you see all of these journalists get fired, in order to provide a return on investment for media investors, right? That's another big issue that we're seeing. And going back to Trump supporters for just a second, and some of the people who have been protesting the stay-at-home orders, I just always find it so fascinating when people say that they're concerned about a tyrannical government, they're concerned about a government that's too big, that would violate their constitutional rights, and they think staying home to slow the spread of this pandemic is an example of that. But in reality, I mean, our freedoms have been scaled back quite a bit since 2001. Government has only gotten bigger in all the wrong ways. And it's just incredible how much we're losing the messaging war on that, right? Because all the focus is on the wrong things. We should be focusing on the ways that government, with the help of corporations, with the, relationship with corporations, have infringed on so many of our rights, including privacy rights.
Totally. And that's why I think it's really important that we don't cede that conversation and we talk about what threatens these things, period. And it is these big institutions, and many of them are private. And essentially, look, it is a private public hybrid. But I love in that Mark Ames piece that his point is that, as terrifying as it is to go up against the intelligence apparatus, it's even more dangerous in many respects to go up against private power. So we really need to keep that in mind. Another thing I wanted to just say about Trump, and look, I want to actually be balanced about this because, part of the reason that everybody I think does overreact and isn't strategic about Trump at times, partially because of all the dumb shit that we see in the resistance, and we've talked about that plenty of times. The mainstream Democratic Party is embarrassing. But obviously, Donald Trump does, stupid, despicable, avarice things on a daily basis. That's also true in part of the diet, obviously. So it is, I can understand why it's tricky for people. But I'm thinking really specifically, there's a new report that just came out in the Financial Times that does a really good job of going to the specifics of all the ways in which Donald Trump specifically, and of course there's a system failure, there's a collapse of public health care. Andrew Cuomo needs to be grilled relentlessly. Absolutely. And Donald Trump has done everything wrong that you could possibly do. And as president, he bears the most responsibility from the catastrophe of this pandemic and the loss of human life and the economics of it, everything else. The buck does stop with him. And this Financial Times piece goes into just great detail on his, his brattiness, his arrogance, his psychopathy in terms of, human life, and his total lack of interest in the consequences. And it's a really good piece. It's an important piece. Everybody should be sharing it and reading it. And honestly, the first thing that struck me when I tweeted out was like, this one actually is really important. But because of like the 50 other pieces about his funny tweets or, whatever else, and again, it all gets conflated, which is another really big problem. Like, this is another huge problem with the resistance, is it's like if you have a feed where it's like Donald Trump is running a vicious racist border policy, which he is, and then that's next to Donald Trump said something that actually makes a lot of intuitive sense to people about a trade tariff, and then that's next to he tweeted out something hilarious about a politician or entertainer that nobody likes. You're not only are you're strategically wrong, you're really undermining the punch of the one thing in that 3 list that is actually really serious. But I also think the onus is on us, for all of us who are sick of the melodrama and the stupidity and the lack of strategy around Trump, to also remember things like this Financial Times article, that this guy is presiding over a failed state, absolutely does not care. And I have no doubt in their calculus, they look at the demographic rundowns of who's dying from the virus, and they think to themselves, no problem, those aren't our voters.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can almost see it happening in real time, especially with some of the Fox News hosts like Tucker Carlson, who took the pandemic seriously in the beginning, and then all of a sudden he had a change of heart. Like, where did that change of heart come from? And it was after some of those statistics were released showing who's disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But, in regard to Trump's tweets, I agree with you 100%. I just feel like this need to relitigate whether Donald Trump is racist based on a tweet is nonsense. He's racist. We all know it. We don't need to keep relitigating it. Of course. And so definitely raise alarm when you see actual constitutional rights being violated by the commander in chief. Like, that's a huge issue. And that's when you need to raise the alarm. But the billion story about Trump saying or doing something racist is not something that needs to be like relitigated. I think that it's safe. It's safe at this point to move on to the next step, right? Instead of asking the same damn question over and over again.
Let alone when he says something.
Like go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and let alone when he's just saying something that's funny or something that actually will make some sense to some people. I mean, that was another thing that happened with Trump. The way he's attacking NATO, I don't agree with, although we do need to ultimately radically change NATO. But, like the idea that normal people are sitting around going like, oh, I can't believe you'd insult our European partners like that. No, they're not. That's going to make a hell of a lot of sense intuitively what he's saying, even if it's, you can complicate it about like, why should we pay all the money and not get things back? And it's ridiculous.
Yeah. There just hasn't really been an effective response to any of his like online provocations. It's only helped to like strengthen his base and their support for him. But I love this story, and I love that you came at it from a very different perspective than what we've seen covered in the media, which is, hey, let's also focus on how private industry is involved in this and how devastating that is, especially when private industry has so much of our data to begin with, right?
Absolutely.
And the NSA, government agencies who feel the need to spy on Americans indiscriminately do so with the help of private industry. That's what we learned through Edward Snowden. You have the telecommunications companies willy-nilly handing this data to government agencies who demand it. And so it's just something that we need to keep in mind, because everything that we're doing, especially now during this pandemic, so many people are working from home. All of this information, all of this data is vulnerable to abuse.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break before we get to our commentary. I do want to give everyone an update on what's happening with this upcoming stimulus bill, which recently passed in the House. Have some thoughts, and I'll share them with you when we return. Welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Now I want to kind of move on to some of the news that's been getting a lot of attention, online, on Twitter, especially among progressives. And it has to do with the next round of stimulus that was just debated and passed in the House. So the House just voted on another round of coronavirus stimulus, and they're referring to it as the HEROES Act. And as I think many people expected, there were important progressive provisions left out of this legislation. And it's definitely devastating, especially because there seemed to be a lot more coordination among progressive lawmakers and even outside progressive groups. But when push came to shove, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi got her way, and the final legislation didn't include incredibly important provisions, which I'll get to in just a second. But first, I think it's important to kind of contextualize everything and discuss what happened in the previous stimulus bill, where progressives actually had less leverage. So before, I think progressives had a little bit of difficulty in organizing. Ida Chavez at The Intercept wrote a great piece about this. And she writes, instead of organizing as a bloc to make coordinated demands or threatening to withhold votes, the progressive approach has been to meet with leadership individually with legislative wish lists with the hope that working behind the scenes will influence the legislation. Now, we've talked about theory of change here on Weekends, and my perspective is, if your theory of change is working with corrupt politicians who literally have a financial interest in defeating your provisions, you're not going to win. And so, like, the idea of trying to reason with Nancy Pelosi, it just seems nonsensical to me. I haven't seen that strategy work, and I think progressives who tried that strategy in the last stimulus bill saw how difficult it is to persuade her, because again, you have to talk about her incentives, her financial priorities, and honestly, these progressive policies ain't it. Now, all of a sudden, things started to change, right? So after that stimulus bill passed, progressives actually start coordinating with one another. You have the Congressional Progressive Caucus working with outside progressive groups like Indivisible, Move On. And that gave people a lot of hope. And also keep in mind that progressives had a lot more leverage this time around, because the GOP has made it abundantly clear that they plan on defeating this bill. They think that, the deficit is out of control at this point. We're concerned about spending. And so we are not going to vote for legislation that's going to provide much needed relief to average Americans. So that means that Nancy Pelosi needs progressive lawmakers in the House to vote in favor of this bill, right? So progressives have more leverage. And let me just say, since the GOP has made it clear that they plan on defeating this legislation in the Senate, this is mostly a symbolic bill, right? This is essentially a way for House Democrats to say, this is where our values are. This is what we want to prioritize. This is how we want to help the average American. And even under this like symbolic environment, you can't get someone like Nancy Pelosi to prioritize any type of progressive policy proposals. So in the end, what did the House overwhelmingly vote in favor of? Basically legislation that will not include $2,000 payments a month to families during the duration of this pandemic, which people desperately need in order to be able to pay their bills. It will not include the robust student loan debt forgiveness that was initially proposed by progressives. It also will not allow Americans to temporarily enroll in Medicare during the duration of the pandemic, which I think is incredibly important. Instead, this will be a way of subsidizing COBRA, which is a disastrous idea, because while workers might not be able to pay for their deductibles, House leadership is saying, well, we can help with premiums. Okay, but what is that going to do for someone who has no money to eat, much less pay or afford extremely expensive medical bills, right? So if you're hit with a huge deductible, you don't have the money to pay that deductible. You'll still be in financial ruin. And so there's also going to be a bailout for lobbyists in this legislation, something that Nancy Pelosi has been very much in favor of. And so you got to question, what went wrong? You have progressives organizing finally. They have some leverage. This is a symbolic bill. Like, what did they do wrong? How did this kind of fall apart? And so I think it is important to kind of see what kind of mistakes were made along the way so we can prevent them in the future, right? And I have 3 takeaways from this. First, let me tell you what happened, though. So there was actually a lack of coordination. Even though there was more organizing done, the truth of the matter is this group of progressives didn't agree with one another. And I think there are certainly people within the Progressive Caucus who aren't necessarily progressive and aren't in line with the policies that we desperately need. So for instance, on April 23rd, Indivisible, with a few other groups, asked Democrats to pledge a no vote on the next coronavirus package if it leaves out their priorities. The ultimatum, though, bothered some lawmakers in the coalition who believe they shouldn't be put in the position of voting against desperately needed aid. Ocasio-Cortez had also threatened a no vote on the interim package during the April 20th news conference, which angered and surprised some of her colleagues who believed they should be winning positive support instead, according to people familiar with the matter. And then there was an issue with Move On. Basically, Move On decided to applaud this legislation, even though it left out the progressive policy proposals that we need. And that gave Nancy Pelosi all that she needed to go out there and say, I got progressive support. This is a great bill. Everybody, look at what a boss I am. I rip papers. I do sarcastic claps. I'm a real winner. I'm the resistance, right? So despite the bill's failure to include Jayapal's paycheck guarantee, MoveOn released a statement signed by a sweeping number of progressive groups, noting that it wasn't perfect, but praising it and urging its passage, pledging to mobilize their millions of members to pass the bill. And let me be clear about something. There are parts of this bill that should be applauded. It's not robust enough, not nearly robust enough, but it does expand the unemployment benefits, which I think are incredibly important. It does have a provision focused on saving the post office. I also think that's important. There's a provision on mail-in voting, again, important. But when it comes to like the basics, the fundamentals to survive in the middle of a pandemic, this bill leaves out, the ability to just enroll in Medicare and not have to worry about whether or not going to the doctor is going to bankrupt you during the pandemic. And so with MoveOn's statements at hand, Nancy Pelosi was able to affirm to her caucus that she won the support of progressive groups, and she quickly dismissed the Congressional Progressive Caucus request to delay the vote. She then rewrote the bill, introducing what's known as a manager's amendment, moving it to the right in key areas, including on relief for student debt. Okay. And then I want to just give you Max Berger's comment on this, which blew my mind, really, because I feel like knowing who Max Berger is, someone who's very in tune with what's going on in our political climate, this is just a shocking statement because he should know better. He says, at some point, you have to ask yourself if the reason that Pelosi doesn't include more oversight of the bailouts or regular checks to working people is because she just doesn't believe in those things, not because they're politically unhelpful. She doesn't believe in those things. She is paid. She is literally paid to not believe in those things. You know better than that. So real quick, I just want to give you my takeaways because I think it's important. First off, consider your theory of change, because if your theory of change is working with someone who has $45 million invested in real estate, you are not, under any circumstance, going to get rent forgiveness or mortgage forgiveness. This is a woman who makes a lot of money off of real estate. That's her financial interest. She's not going to look out for the best interest of the vast majority of Americans who are struggling to pay rent right now. Second, know your enemies. You need to know your enemies. Just because someone is in a caucus with you doesn't necessarily mean that they're in line with what you are pushing for. And look, maybe to call them enemies goes a little too far, but I think one of the most enlightening things for me personally in this 2020 election cycle was just the clarity that I now have of who's on our side, who's actually willing to work alongside progressives to accomplish the things that we need to better this country, and who's going to fight us. And there are a lot of people who pose as these resistance Democrats who are actually going to fight us harder than the GOP will. Okay. And again, this is a symbolic bill. If you can't even like message to voters, message to Americans that, hey, you know what? Republicans might fight us on this, but this is what we stand for. If you can't do that, then you don't stand for any of these progressive policy proposals that some of these lawmakers claim to. And then finally, why didn't these, like there was a little more organizing happening among progressives. So it was mostly lawmakers and progressive groups. Why not involve some political activism with workers? We know that workers have been striking. We know that they're hungry for change. We know that they want to fight. They should have been included in this equation. Maybe a coordinated effort where, like mass strikes happen throughout the country and workers will refuse to go back to work unless these progressive provisions are not only included in the House legislation, but passed in the Senate. I mean, hold these corporations' feet to the fire, right? So I just feel like that was really left out of the equation this time around. And I also want to just note, despite all the upheaval and all the anger toward what happened with this round of stimulus, the only progressive who really voted against this was Pramila Jayapal. AOC voted for it. All members of the squad voted for it. And I get it. They feel pressured to vote for it because a lot of people are struggling and there are portions of this bill that are important. But we need to be more aggressive. And I think, again, the fundamentals are not in this bill. We need to ensure that people are taken care of medically and that they're not worried about losing housing as a result of this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I like how you say the fundamentals aren't in this bill. I've been obsessively watching The Last Dance, so I'm all about getting the fundamentals in play. But yeah, I think this is also why it's really important to look at maybe having a different conversation around even this idea of changing the Democratic Party caucus. I've been mentioning my buddy Dustin Guastella a lot, who's a union organizer and a Philly DSA, who also writes for Jacobin, has a really good stay-at-home that people should look up and watch. And of really thinking about the distinction between politicians who try to root themselves, and there's almost none today, as an example, in the labor union movement, and say, like, I will be the senator or the congressperson from organized labor, versus a lot of where the energy has been now, and we see it manifested in these different groups, some of which do some really good work, some of which like move on, do questionable moves like this. So I think if we properly understand move on, it kind of makes sense. Where you're really just looking at, you're just sort of playing a nicer version of Nancy Pelosi's game, which is that she really only cares about affluent suburban districts primarily. And some kind of so-called progressive groups are really interested in the same fight. They're interested in, like, basically, okay, what if we get the same safe Democratic districts with the same class composition, but move things a little bit more to the left? And I think that, just to the point you're making, Anna, that formulation is really difficult, because you're not going to be able to sustain any sort of momentum or pressure in that framework. It's going to always split towards people making the individual votes they think are best, or making like a calculation that might make sense. Like, hey, I don't want to be on record voting against these good things, versus I represent a constituency. These are those constituencies' non-negotiables. It's not, this or that poll number or flavor of the week. Like, there's an organization behind it, and I'm actually going to put some muscle into it. And ironically, a guy like Sherrod Brown, who's, not plenty of things, I'm not he's like not the most exciting politician in the world, but he's a senator from Ohio, and he's done a lot for labor at a time that labor has been under siege for decades. And he organizes his politics a bit more in that way. And I think that's actually a more relevant thing to learn from than, even some of these great progressives who don't have a context yet for sustaining these fights. And that's exactly what you just summarized there.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you know what? We can continue this conversation with our guest after the break. John Nichols from The Nation joins us to talk about his book and, searching for the soul of the Democratic Party. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Joining us now is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation and author of The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, John Nichols. John, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great honor to be with both of you.
Your book is so important for the political climate that we're dealing with right now, because I think there are a lot of questions about where the left goes from here, especially when it comes to progressive policies that we need to, obviously improve our healthcare system and prevent the planet from being impossible to live on. And so you write about an important political figure that hasn't gotten much attention in our history books, and it's Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was a real fighter for the New Deal. He actually managed to run as Roosevelt's VP. And I just wanted you to give the audience like some more information about who he was, what he stood for, and why, literature really didn't focus on him much.
That's a great way to begin, because there's a reason why Henry Wallace has been written out of our history. And it is that he, as Roosevelt's vice president, and in the period after Roosevelt died, fought harder than anyone else to keep alive the basic premises of the New Deal and to extend them. Remember, the New Deal was imperfect. It didn't achieve everything it was supposed to achieve, or even everything that we might have wanted it to. But Wallace understood that. And so in the midst of World War II, he said, look, the United States has got to beat fascism internationally. And then the United States has to come home and beat those figures in the United States who practice what he referred to as an Americanized fascism. And so he was prepared to take on racism, sexism, class divides that were so brutal that they left huge portions of society behind. He was also prepared to change U.S. foreign policy, to steer away from colonialism and from imperialism, and to try and dial down militarism. And so he was a very radical figure. And had he remained on Roosevelt's ticket in 1944, he would have become president of the United States. And there is simply no question, American history and world history would have been dramatically different.
John, I'm really interested in if you could explain to us how, and it's a tradition that's been under siege for quite some time, but this like Midwest prairie populist thing in the United States isn't a myth. It's a real thing, and it's a thing down from national leadership like Henry Wallace and even people who are actually Republicans from Wisconsin, but it's also places on a local and regional level when socialists were getting elected at the turn of the last century. It's militant trade unionism. Where did that tradition come from? How does Henry Wallace fit in it?
He fits in it very well. In fact, Henry Wallace was a Republican. He was Teddy Roosevelt backer in 1912. And then in 1924, like many left-wing Republicans, and there were left-wing Republicans in those days, he left the party fold and backed the independent candidacy in 1924 of Robert M. La Follette and the Progressives. Now, to understand how different those times were from today, recognize that you had Republicans, left-wing Republicans, and the Socialist Party, and Eugene Victor Debs, backing La Follette at the same time. And so there was a tradition in the Midwest. It was rooted in immigration patterns as well. You had a lot of Scandinavians, a lot of Germans who left in 1848 during the periods of revolution. Many people who came to the Midwest came as folks who had read Marx, or at least read elements of Marx. And so it's not that shocking that you saw a planting of these traditions. But the other thing that's really important to understand was the Midwest was really kind of left behind in a lot of American development in that period. You had a case where states like North Dakota were in an almost feudal circumstance. They were so overwhelmed by the power of bankers and the big, what were in those days were agribusiness companies. We have bigger ones now. And so you ended up developing a tradition that was really fascinating. It was very populist economically. It was also very, very anti-militarist. And that's, I think, one of the things that gets lost as we kind of bring this all into the current moment. That one of the mistakes I think that a lot of progressives, leftists, whoever today make is to underplay the anti-militarism and the anti-imperialism. Because interestingly enough, those elements of it are incredibly popular in areas where, frankly, the Democratic Party has fallen way behind.
Oh, that's interesting. So you'd argue that focusing in on militarism could possibly be a good play for progressives today?
100%. I couldn't emphasize it more. Again, using Wallace as a touchstone, but not as a required, guide for everything. Just as a touchstone.
Go ahead. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh no, it's just to say that what he was saying at the end of World War II, I think, holds to be true right up to the current moment, and that is that if you want to have domestic progress, if you want to, really advance, you also have to keep an eye on the threat of militarism, imperialism, colonialism, all of these things, because these draw us away from a focus on domestic progress. Now, it's great to have a progressive internationalism, to engage with a sense of solidarity with movements around the world, and Wallace certainly spoke of that. But it is important to understand that when the United States starts to become the policeman of the world, it usually does so on behalf of corporations. And that becomes a circumstance where you really stall things out at home. The best example of that was in the mid-1960s, when you really saw movements force government to advance. So civil rights movement, anti-poverty movements influenced by Michael Harrington and others were really having a huge impact in 1964, 1965, 1966. And then suddenly you have the Vietnam War, and it pulls coalitions apart. It undermines the progress. And the interesting thing is that Henry Wallace, who's the beginning of my book, which is really kind of a history up to the current day, Henry Wallace lived till 1965. In his last days, he suffered from some very serious ailments. He wasn't able to speak. He could only write on a tablet. And one of the last things he wrote was, and I'm paraphrasing here, a reference to Lyndon Johnson leading the United States into the Vietnam War. And he said that if he does this, everything will fall apart, everything will burn. And I just think he recognized that. Other visionaries have recognized that throughout history. And we can't let it be lost to our discourse. You talk about progress at home, but you also have to recognize that often our progress at home, even these great victories that we can achieve, are undermined by huge military budgets and, frankly, by military adventurism.
So talk us through this Henry Wallace character. And he kind of reminds me of C.L.R. James. Somebody said of the Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James, it might have been Christopher Hitchens, that one of the things about James is that he got all of the big calls right of his time. He was a fighter against imperialism. He was a fighter against, obviously, the colonial order, the capitalist order. Then he was a committed Marxist till the day of his death, but he also had a critique of Stalinism at a time when it was, it was an actual, it was a real debate. So, and Henry Wallace, especially for a guy who got to be vice president, and I was saying in the opening of the show that I listened to probably 20 years ago when I was a teenager, an interview that Christopher Lydon did with a former Iowa senator about Henry Wallace, and it blew my mind as a kind of World Bank protest kid, that someone like this could be vice president of the United States, that he was, not triangulating in terms of segregation. He was a fierce fighter against apartheid, Jim Crow America. He wanted to extend and enhance and was influential in Roosevelt's great advance in terms of the sort of extension of the Bill of Rights, new economic Bill of Rights, but also fascism, imperialism, colonialism. How did this guy fit it all together? What was like the underlying worldview and commitment that made him get so many calls right?
It's a really good question, Michael. And, one thing that I do emphasize in the book is that Wallace didn't get everything right. He made mistakes. One of the greatest things about him was his ability to acknowledge those mistakes and to discuss them. He was an incredibly open man. He was glad to talk to anybody, debate with anybody, and he was very prepared to engage at the highest level. When Henry Luce, the publisher of Time and Life, wrote an essay on talked about the American century, Wallace came back with the idea saying, no, this should be the century of the common person, the common man, the common woman, and really battled. He loved to battle on ideas, and it was never personal with him, or very rarely. It was about trying to get to the right answer. Now, here's the interesting thing about him. He had a couple of experiences that are highly significant. As a child, really, he was drawn into a lot of agricultural work. And George Washington Carver was someone he met as a kid, actually revered. And so growing up in rural Iowa, he had African-American heroes. And I think that had some influence on him along the way, especially where he turned out to be so far ahead of the curve on issues of race. But he also was a devout Christian. He was very, very moralistic, if you will. And so there were moments where he faced tough questions, and was, which side do you go on? Do you go on the side of exploitation? Do you go on the side of fairness? He made the call to take those tough choices, and they hated him for it. They literally despised him for it. They called him a communist because he was willing to work with communists, even though he was actually, by any measure, he was a capitalist. There's no doubt about it. He was just a very moral capitalist. This is a guy
He was a successful capitalist.
Very successful.
I mean, like personally a successful capitalist. Yeah.
As is often the case, right? The people that are really good at it, they actually understand how to do it, aren't as desperate and as scared as so many of our wealthy people today are. But he would be embarrassed by whatever wealth he attained. His real focus was on, fundamental issues, solving big problems. And the interesting thing was, at one point he was interviewed and he was asked, what are books that have influenced you? And this is literally, I believe, I hope I've got this right, I think it was, during the vice presidential campaign in 1940, going into his vice presidency. And he said, yeah, I've read the Bible and Marx, and so the interesting thing is, he was really open to a tremendous amount of ideas. And at the end of the day, with all of that said, mistakes that he made, strengths that he had, he went to a set of fundamental premises. And that was economic and social and racial justice, preservation of the planet. He was a conservationist. And avoiding wars, doing your best to avoid wars. If you had to fight a war like World War II, fight it for moral purposes to beat fascism, but don't just go around the world looking for wars to fight. That's you pretty much sum the guy up with that.
So, John, what was the establishment's reception to Wallace?
Boy, did they hate him. They despised him really from the start. Roosevelt brought him in 1940 because the New Deal coalition was huge. This is the thing to understand. Roosevelt won massive victories, and Democrats today like to say, oh, wow, the New Deal coalition. But what they don't always recognize is that coalition extended all the way from the most scorching, awful racists in the South over to militant socialists. It included bankers and civil rights leaders. So you had this coalition that was always hard to manage, always stretching and pulling against itself at times. Roosevelt could hold it together, but he became increasingly concerned that as we were heading toward World War II, that the Southerners, the bankers, the more conservative forces within the coalition were really a burden and a challenge to getting the country pulled together to fight against fascism. And so he replaced his sitting vice president with Henry Wallace, who was the most militant member of his cabinet. And it was a clear move to the left. It was at a time when Roosevelt was starting to talk about the Four Freedoms, as he was moving toward talking about an economic Bill of Rights. And Wallace came in, and he did not pull his punches. He kept pushing for a progressive vision. And really what tripped it all up for Wallace, why the establishment, went to the mat to pull him down, was that in 1943, in the United States, we had a series of race riots. The histories of World War II often try to portray the United States as very, very united. In fact, the United States was pulling at itself. It was straining in this very difficult moment. And because A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders had succeeded in getting military industries, war industries integrated, there were forces that were trying to disrupt that were trying to, again, pull at that. And you did see a rise of racism, violent racism, and not just in the South, but in northern cities like Detroit. And there was a race riot in Detroit in 1943. Henry Wallace got on a plane, flew immediately to Detroit, and appeared within days of the race riots at a mass rally in front of an integrated rally of thousands of trade unionists, mostly organized by the UAW and more militant unions. And he said at the start of his speech, "We are fighting in Europe against folks who divide people along lines of race and religion and ethnicity, and that is evil. Here at home, if there are people who divide us along lines of race and religion and ethnicity, they are practicing," and I quote him directly here, "Americanized fascism." And so in 1943, he made the connection between racism and divisiveness along lines of race, religion, class, and ethnicity as an Americanized fascism. At that point, the establishment pulled out all the stops. The New York Times condemned him. The bankers went wild. The Southern segregationists were ready to get rid of him anyway. And by any measure, it's a big story of the book. They pulled him down. But it is a lesson in how when a visionary tries to move the Democratic Party in a progressive direction, there are very powerful forces that will come together and try and stop that.
Oh, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a follow-up to it because I think that his story is something that we can certainly learn from. And the effort to destroy him and what he wanted to accomplish seems to have worked. And he seemed to have given up on the Democratic Party, something that many voters who have aligned themselves with the Democratic Party for decades are now, also thinking. So you write in your book, Wallace made the work of his rivals easier. He gave up on the Democratic Party and in 1948 mounted a poorly thought out, ill-timed, independent progressive presidential bid, while the threat that Wallace's candidacy posed would briefly pull Truman to the left, it failed to pull many votes, and it gave Wallace's detractors an opening to unleash a furious assault on the man they portrayed as clueless and calculating, marginal, and dangerous. I mean, it's incredible how much history repeats itself. And I feel like, there are elements of what you wrote there that we're experiencing today. And I just wanted you to comment on that.
Absolutely. Well, this book starts in 1942, 1943, amidst World War II. It ends in the summer of 2019, back at Wallace's farmhouse, the place where he was born. I went there with Bernie Sanders in August of 2019. And, look, I don't see history as having beginnings and ends. I think that most of the fights that were fought are still being fought. There are new fights to be fought. We learn things along the way, but we often fall back into the traps. And so what I would say in answer to your very good question, Anna, and we could take it as far as you want to go on this, is that kind of the core point of my book is to understand that there are visionaries who arise at particular times in our history, not just Henry Wallace, but other folks. Ron Dellums in the early 1970s, George McGovern as well, Jesse Jackson, Shirley Chisholm. We can run down the list, and they fight for the soul of the party. And so frequently they are marginalized and beaten down, beaten back. And we need to understand that. We need to understand that that reality exists. It has existed. And so then the question is, do you go out to try and create a third party? That is a credible action that great men and women have taken in the past. And sometimes it has had success. The greatest success was when socialists and radical abolitionists and land reformers got together and created the Republican Party in 1854. And so it can be done, right? You can do it. But the lesson of Wallace, and frankly, a lesson that we get a lot along the way, is if you don't do it with enough power and enough energy at the right moment, you run the risk of being welcomed to do it by power. Power says, yeah, go out and make that other effort. Go do that other thing. Because our system is so gamed against third party, fourth party, multi-party democracy that it's almost as if a switch is flipped. The machine goes on. They're like, oh, okay, somebody's doing this. Here's what we'll do. We'll make it hard for them to get on the ballot, harder than ever in a year with coronavirus and social distancing. We'll keep them out of the debates. We will change the debate rules however we have to, right? We will then, at the end, literally beat the hell out of them in our media, right? Like if you thought Bernie Sanders got a hard time in the late stages of the primaries on American media, which I think he did, you should take a look at what they did to Wallace in the last weeks of the 1948 campaign. It was stunning. They pulled everything they could out. He was a communist. He was a guru following spiritualist. He was a dupe.
He sounds cool.
What?
Those all sound cool to me. I love it.
I know, but this is the best.
Communist with a guru. This is my guy.
Michael, you're going to love this the best. One of my favorite attacks on him was 60 years old when he was running for president, right? And he was in incredibly good shape. He was physically, very athletic. He played tennis and that. They attacked him for being healthy and in good shape. They said,
That's amazing.
Man keeps himself in good shape. What's up with that?
What's going on there?
I know. So the reality is, here's what he was attacked for.
The ideal candidate.
Well, he had his imperfections, trust me.
Yeah, I know.
I write about that quite a bit. But here's what he's attacked for not wanting to have a Cold War, for not wanting to have a Red Scare, for not wanting to let racism continue, for not wanting to let sexism continue, for not wanting to have deep class divides in this country, for wanting the United States to get on the side of anti-imperialism and ending colonialism, and for trying to build out a world where the military and industrial complex wasn't the dominant force in U.S. foreign policy. And he was, they hated him for that. And you know what? They will hate anyone else who comes forward and tries to advance such a vision, be it, any time along the way, right up to today. And my book is only the first part of my book is about Wallace. The rest of the book is about how these patterns repeat and what we should learn from them. But my message on what you ought to learn is that you have to know the fight you're in. And if you're going to fight within the Democratic Party, you have to know that you're fighting for the soul of the Democratic Party. This isn't some little squabble, right? It's not a family feud. The forces that want the Democratic Party to be a centrist, center-right, neoliberal, neoconservative party, those forces will never give an inch. They're going to fight with everything they've got. If you're going to fight within the Democratic Party, you have to fight that hard and with that kind of passion. It requires building movements in. It requires strengthening trade unionism, et cetera. And here's the core thing. It requires progressive Democrats, when they get power, if they do, right, if you break through and you get power, to use that power immediately on behalf of the movements and the coalitions that brought you there. That was what Roosevelt understood. For all of his imperfections and all of his flaws, that is what Wallace promised to do in the aftermath of World War II. And my belief is, had Henry Wallace been elected, he would have implemented a massive housing program. He would have implemented a massive jobs program. And instead of Democrats losing power in 1946 in the Congress, which they did, and then you got Taft-Hartley, you got, the beginnings of the Red Scare, the whole bit there, we could have gone a very different direction. Well, that keeps repeating. 1976, Jimmy Carter gets elected. 2 years later, Democrats have severe setbacks because Carter didn't act boldly enough. 1992, Bill Clinton gets elected. 2 years later, Democrats have huge setbacks. Again, I would argue because Clinton backed NAFTA and did a weak healthcare reform, et cetera, et cetera. 2008, Barack Obama comes to power with great majorities and frankly, with, I think, a pretty good vision on a lot of stuff. And then because you kept kind of pulling back on things and doing, I think, moderate things that tried to pull the Democratic Party together, you ended up in 2010 with massive setbacks that undermined the rest of the tenure. My bottom line is this. If you're going to fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, and if by chance you win it, you better govern from a standpoint of using your power rather than just sort of, being a little better than the Republicans.
Yeah, I think crucially, too, that in addition to letting, basically just recapitalizing Wall Street without any accountability and then a convoluted healthcare plan, Obama didn't push for card check, which was the last thing that I could think of in terms of a big fight for a piece of labor legislation that was like on the mainstream media agenda that was campaigned on and then completely jettisoned, and still should be something that's pushed forward today. I want to ask you then about where we're at right now, and I'm going to quote from you, and I'll give you, I guess, a little bit of my view on it. But you quote, this is a recent piece in The Nation. You write, "Biden is not a movement builder. Neither is the Democratic National Committee as it currently exists, but the policy task forces announced this week by Biden and Sanders camps hold out the promise that the party could, in this period of social and economic crisis, become something that the vast majority of Americans can believe in." Now, I guess on one hand, I have the folks who I think are, pushing to do another let's, vote for some third party candidate that gets 500,000 votes. And I think not only doesn't contribute, I think that actually deeply continues to marginalize a progressive agenda, and frankly would undercut what Bernie Sanders has really done in these two runs, which is show you that there is a serious mainstream electoral appetite for things like single payer healthcare and a concern about the inequality crisis. So I resist that, and I have no problem telling people my position has been vote tactically and vote strategically. And if, as an example, you think that trade unionism is essential for not only the revival of the left, I'd frankly say the future of democracy. You have to look at things as boring and as limited, but frankly as relevant as who are you going to get on an NLRB appointments between a Biden or Trump. And that in and of itself means that if you're in a swing state, you should vote strategically. It's not that exciting. It's not, it annoys people, but it is what it is. I can't give people a fantasy version of reality. Now, on the other hand, and I want you to respond to that, obviously, but on the other hand, I think that there's a good medicine in the truth that this was a really big loss. I think that we kind of learned from 2016, or maybe even 2016 was a different historical circumstance where having some things put on a platform maybe signified something. I think it's very clear looking at how Pelosi's managing the House, who the brain trust is around Joe Biden, that this is, even some cases physically, literally on its last legs, this is a corporate third way, center right Democratic Party. And we haven't figured out how to change that yet in any substantive way. You
just put it all on the table, brother.
All for you.
So let me take a moment and
please
try and but it doesn't take that long because hopefully a good answer, to the extent that there is one, isn't complicated. I mean, we go to the heart of the matter. So let us go back and we were talking just a moment ago about, when Barack Obama was president of the United States. Look, we know that Barack Obama knew what we know. He was actually a guy who was steeped in a lot of progressive reading and discussion and thinking, and yet he came into office and he governed in a much more centrist way. I think at the end of the day, that harmed his ability to achieve things that I believe he could have achieved. And I think that we should always look at our history in that way. We should understand where mistakes are made and hopefully try not to make them again. So do we blame an individual? And because there's such a desire on the part of folks who deal with politics to blame individuals. Oh, that guy let us down. Right. That woman let us down. I'm going to tell you this. The Democratic Party lets its own presidents down, right? Because the Democratic Party doesn't give a ironclad agenda. There's not a purpose, a clear purpose to winning, except beating the Republicans. And that's not enough. The Democratic Party has to lock in a set of premises and principles that if it gets power, it will seek to achieve. And it has to take that risk of saying to America, you give us power, we're going to do a Green New Deal. You give us power, we're going to really address the criminal justice system in this country. You give us power, we're going to do these things. That's fundamental. Now, what happens with that? Well, then people come to you no matter how boring your candidate is. You got a Joe Biden for president, people are still going to say, yeah, but this party, if it comes to power, it's actually going to do something. Well, the cynicism about the Democratic Party at this point is well grounded, right? It does pull punches. It does fail at the moment when it should rise. And so that's why I suggest that these task forces that have been created, which I understand fully why they were created, at least why Biden wants them. He wants them for window dressing, right? For, this will make us show unity and stuff like that. I say those are always the time when power makes its biggest mistake, right? When they invite you into the room to show unity, that's the point at which to say, yeah, I'll give you some unity. I'm going to give you an agenda that is based on what 70, 80, 90% of Americans support. Single-payer Medicare for all healthcare, a Green New Deal, ridding our politics of the corruption based in our deference to corporations. I'll give you a unity agenda. And, I don't know what will come of these task forces that may, crumble, crash, and burn, and then we'll be stuck right where we are today. But boy, why not have a fight? Why not go and stir it up? And why not perhaps say to folks that these delayed elections that will occur in June, all the primaries that are to occur, why not say to folks, hey, you could vote in those primaries to send in a signal to the task forces and the party. I don't even care if you like Bernie Sanders. You can dislike Bernie Sanders. You can say he's not the one.
No, you can't. Come on.
Well,
don't be a chump like Bernie Sanders.
I like him, but I'm going to tell you, I'm willing to build the biggest coalition possible. Yeah, I'm a coalition builder. And I'm saying, say to folks, whatever you think, if you want single payer, if you want a Green New Deal, if you want to really get serious about addressing economic and social and racial injustice in this country, if you want to start talking about peace and ending the influence of the military-industrial complex on our politics, cast a primary vote that empowers these folks like AOC and Sarah Nelson from the flight attendants and Stephanie Kelton, the great economist, and the folks from the Sunrise Movement who are on these task forces. Let's give them a boost and go for what might happen. Now, if it fails, right? That's why the good Lord gave us a long period until elections, right? We can sort out what we think. We can sort out how we feel about these things. But if you're fighting for the soul of the Democratic Party, if that's the purpose you've chosen, then fight, really fight. If you choose to do a third party, I'm not going to condemn you. And I'm going to, people in a democracy, you have a right to commit to the political journey that you're going to take. But I'm going to tell you that if you're fighting inside the Democratic Party, you do Joe Biden no favors by going soft. You do him no favors by, saying, yeah, listen to your consultants, keep doing the things you've been doing, keep, go down that center route, go down that center right route. Just tell people you're slightly better than the Republicans, and that'll be enough. That does him no favors, none at all. And so, frankly, in this case, I think that also does our democracy no favors. I think what I hope to see in November is a transformational election. I want a 1932. I want a 1940. I want the big one. And here's the interesting final thing I'd say, coming off your very good question. If we're in a circumstance like this, if this is the battle that we're on, then we have to say, well, maybe there's stuff that's bigger than us. Maybe there's stuff that's bigger than personalities. Maybe there's stuff that's bigger than parties.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, a global pandemic and the worst mass unemployment in history.
Yep.
Shouldn't those realities, those overwhelming realities, open up doors to a new politics, right? And if wherever that new politics plants itself, whatever, if it plants itself in the Democratic Party, if it plants itself somewhere, but boy, shouldn't we open up to a new politics, to something more and better, because the solutions are not going to come out of the same old places. And then we go back to the 1930s and you say, well, okay, when those things happened, well, then countries made choices, right? And some countries made horrific choices. Some countries went to the right. They went toward authoritarianism, toward fascism. Remember, some of the worst players in the world competed in elections.
Yep.
They gamed them, they cheated, but they competed. They were in the game. Other countries went the right way. Other countries went to the left. I don't know exactly how this moment compares to the 1930s, and I'm not making, immature, childish comparisons. Things are different, times are different, etc. But boy, if we are facing a global pandemic and mass unemployment, shouldn't we be trying with everything we've got? Because we know that going to what I describe as the left, going toward a Green New Deal, going toward economic and social and racial justice, going toward an anti-militarist vision, going toward an anti-imperialist vision, I think that's the way out. I think that's the answer, or at least one of the answers. So shouldn't we fight for that with everything we've got?
Absolutely. This was such a great conversation. John, thank you so much for joining us and talking about your book and, some of your thoughts about where we are in this current political moment. Everyone check out his book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. John, thank you again.
I'm really honored to be with both of you.
It's great. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Are we taking a brief break, or are we going straight to SALT?
Let's take a quick break. We'll come back and talk about the absurdity of Bill Gates.
Not good. Man, this show is really good. And if you guys could only hear the break conversations, whew.
Yeah, we're gonna move that over to like actual like live discussions where you guys are included as well. But yeah, I love that last interview. I think that Nichols is so great. I love his writing at The Nation. And, you know, we got a PDF copy of his book to prepare for this interview. And I thought, yeah, I'll just like skim it. And I just caught myself sitting there and reading it, not wanting to put it down. Because I think historical context matters so much. It just really does help inform some of the decisions that we can make moving forward.
Oh, yeah, I'm a big Nichols fan. Maybe not all of the things we say in the breaks, but more of them we'll try to do. We got Salt, Next week, I got to say, just give me a 30-second tangent. Adolph Reed was on TMBS on Tuesday, and somehow we ended up making fun of Stacey Abrams. And then you and I were talking about just how, like, unbelievably thirsty Stacey Abrams is for VP. So that might be a preview for the future. But
yeah,
we've got a very big villain that a lot of dopes think is a good guy for this week's Salt. Who is it, Anna?
Well, I thought that we could talk about the absurdity of Bill Gates, because in a lot of interviews where he talks about how society needs to be improved, he kind of talks with both sides of his mouth. Like, on one hand, he sees the importance of the federal government stepping in and taking care of situations like healthcare, for instance, having the right system in place to respond to a pandemic. But then on the other hand, he's very resistant to democratic socialists and some of the robust taxation policies that have been proposed by progressive lawmakers, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And I wanted to talk about that because he's part of the problem, and I don't think that he realizes it. So let's break it down. So a few days ago, there was a tweet by a Recode writer. And so he says, "Scoop, Bill Gates is exploring ways to convince other billionaires to donate more for coronavirus. Ideas that Gates has considered include launching a new COVID fund for billionaires who signed the giving pledge per sources." Okay. So at that point, AOC responded in a very snarky way. And keep in mind that Gates has come out against some of AOC's policy proposals. She responds by saying, "If only there were some public fund billionaires could pay into, along with everyone else that helps fund our infrastructure, hospitals, and public systems all at once. It could even be a modest percentage of what they earn every year. We could have an agency collected and everything." Now, that snarky response is obviously referring to billionaires, millionaires paying more in taxes. And just a quick tangent, this Mark Goldwyn guy responds back saying, "This describes an income tax." Yeah, like, way to miss, the sarcasm in AOC's response.
Yeah,
but
I think she got that, dude.
Yeah, exactly. It's just so ridiculous. But anyway, going back to Gates, in the past, as I've said, he's been resistant to things like the wealth tax. Even in some instances, in some interviews, he's explained that he doesn't even necessarily think a progressive income tax would raise the funds that we need in order to better our society. And so here's a little taste of what he said in one of these podcasts. I believe this was the podcast for The Verge. Take a look.
I believe U.S. tax rates can be more progressive. Now, you finally have some politicians who are so extreme that I'd say, no, that's even beyond. You do start to create tax dodging and disincentives and, an incentive to have the income show up in other countries and things. But we can be more progressive. The estate tax and the tax on capital, the way the FICA Social Security tax works, we can be more progressive without really threatening the income generation, what you have left to decide how to spread around.
So Michael, tell me what you think about his perspective here. He thinks a progressive tax where the top marginal tax rate is at 70% is a little too crazy. And he also seems to be resistant to the wealth tax. But these are the types of taxes we need in order to fund the infrastructure that he's calling for on a federal level.
Yeah, I just think that having billionaires, and I don't mean this morally actually at all, like there could be billionaires, and I don't think Bill Gates is one of them, and it's probably pretty unlikely, to be honest, but there could be very nice people that are billionaires, but functionally that level of concentration of wealth is just incompatible with a democracy. You can't have individuals have that level of power disproportionate to the rest of the system. And I think it's also really important, and I'll cite another Jacobin article. People should be subscribing to Jacobin. I'll just say that while we do this. There was a great piece that came out a couple weeks ago by Rob Larson called Bill Gates's philanthropic giving is a racket. And he traces going back to Bill Gates's sort of moves into philanthropy to the horrible public perception of Bill Gates in the late 1990s as a monopolist, which he was. He was, in fact, such an aggressive monopolist that Bill Clinton's Justice Department went after Microsoft. Now, think about the Clinton and Gore administration that was like allowing mergers of every kind, that was swallowing up, that was rebranding the Democratic Party as, you know, at the very, I mean, not only a competitor with Republicans, but maybe even more in certain sectors, potentially tech, the corporate America party. That he was still so aggressive and avarice as a company and as a CEO that he caught the attention of that Justice Department. So, and that
Amazing.
correlates with him starting to go into philanthropy. And then we got to then look at like, okay, what is he actually doing? Pushing for high stakes testing, attacking teachers' unions. He's still here. Andrew Cuomo, as part of Andrew Cuomo's nightmare plans for New York. Bill Gates is going to get invited in to further damage public education in this state. His fixation on population in Africa and developing countries, I'm sorry, is innately disturbing and creepy, does not answer to fundamental questions around consumption or development. Also, I mean, look, I'll just say, use your favorite search engine, and I don't, socialize with Jeffrey Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'll say. So I think the idea that this guy is like, and that he comes out during a pandemic of which has been facilitated going back, starting aggressively in the 80s with the complete dismantling of public health networks internationally from obviously the United States, but World Bank and IMF plans to this day gut developing countries. European policymakers that have demanded member states cut their health funding. He is part and parcel of that. And I don't care how much he washes his reputation through philanthropy.
Yeah, I love that you pointed out, very briefly, the testing effort by Bill Gates, because there's a story out today about how the Trump administration is terrible because they have stopped Bill Gates and his efforts to provide at-home testing to people in Seattle. And it's important to keep in mind that while Donald Trump and his administration is a complete and utter disaster, doesn't necessarily mean that everything that he does is a complete and utter disaster. These tests are not FDA approved, and I think it is important to have federal regulation of the drugs that we take and the testing that we rely on in order to determine whether or not we have an illness. And if this is not FDA approved, you could have false positives, you could have false negatives, and you don't want to toy with people's lives here. And it reminded me of a really great interview on Jacobin that I highly recommend you guys read. It was with Philip Murkowski, and he, Murkowski, yes. And he talks about, he talks about how, there's this thought process regarding the pandemic and how this is the best opportunity for leftists to accomplish their policy goals. But what we're actually seeing is the neoliberal project really thriving here. And he even mentions the FDA in the middle of this interview. He says neoliberals see the gutting of FDA controls over drugs, the boosting of privatized telemedicine, which is something they've proposed for a long time, seeking to get rid of the idea that a poor person ought to be able to see a doctor face to face. They also see these developments as blocking a state-run single-payer system in the United States. They believe the crisis made it less likely than before.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand people's intentions. And while it might be painted as nothing but good intentions in the media, just do a little digging and see whether these efforts are really based on good intentions, or if it's just meant to launder someone's image, or secretly, accomplish some of these neoliberal policies that would further, deteriorate our society and our healthcare system.
Yeah, 100%. Bill Gates is not your friend, people.
Right. And, understand that this criticism is very different from the conspiracy theorists on Trump's side. But you don't need to rely on conspiracy theories. I mean, just do a basic analysis of what he's advocated for in the past. And I love that you brought up that correlation of his philanthropic work, like at that time in history, why he decided to pursue it. Anyway.
He may look like Arthur, but he's not your friend. Guys, we have done another great expedition. Next week, of course, we'll be back. We're going to maybe start experimenting with taking some questions from people that give super chats next week. Of course, check out the Jacobin. Definitely, if you can, subscribe to the magazine. It's just an indispensable resource. And of course, subscribe and check out the Stay at Home series. There's just an incredible amount of riches on this channel, including all previous episodes of Weekends, clips, so you can spread the word. And make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, do all of that. Anna and I will be back with you next week. We want to thank Kale, our producer.